The afternoon train to Flaxborough arrived with little ceremony, its engine sighing like a tired beast as it drew to a halt beneath the soot-darkened roof of the station. A few passengers disembarked, their footsteps echoing on the platform, their movements brisk and practical. It was not a day for lingering. The weather had been steadily miserable since morning, a low, soaking drizzle that flattened hats and turned the cobbled forecourt into a treacherous expanse of slick grey stones. Inside the railway buffet, the atmosphere was only marginally improved. The room smelled of damp coats, weak tea, and something faintly medicinal. A clattering urn hissed behind the counter, where Mrs. Pringle, who had been running the place for over 30 years, moved about with the ponderous inevitability of a ship in shallow waters. She served tea and seed cake to a scattering of indifferent travellers, each of whom seemed to be engaged in the quiet business of waiting for trains, for connections, or perhaps for nothing at all. On this particular afternoon, there was nothing remarkable to distinguish the scene. A commercial traveller thumbed through an old newspaper at a corner table, his face obscured by steam rising from his cup. A pair of elderly ladies sat together, murmuring in the secretive tones of lifelong gossip. A boy of no more than 12 sulked beside a pile of luggage, staring with hostility at a slice of cold meat pie he had been persuaded to eat. Everything about the buffet suggested routine, even tedium. At one table, however, a visitor who was no part of the town's ordinary rhythm sat quietly, his posture slightly hunched, as though to make himself smaller. Father Bartholomew Crisp, a priest from Brighton, was an unassuming figure with an air of weary gentleness. His clothes were modest and carefully tended, though they bore the unmistakable marks of long travel. Creased cuffs, scuffed shoes, and a faint sheen of road dust clinging to the hem of his coat. He had arrived earlier that day and taken a room at a nearby lodging house, carrying with him only a small suitcase and a single envelope, which he kept close to his person at all times. Father Crisp sat alone for several minutes, glancing occasionally toward the door, as though expecting someone to arrive. His expression was calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension about him, a subtle tightening around the mouth and eyes. From time to time, his hand moved to the inner pocket of his coat, pressing lightly against the hidden envelope, then retreating again. A young woman entered the buffet and, seeing the room mostly empty, hesitated before choosing a seat near Father Crisp. She appeared to speak politely to him, and he, evidently grateful for the company, responded with a faint but genuine smile. They began to converse in low voices, their words indistinct beneath the general hum of the room. The girl listened intently while the priest spoke, leaning forward slightly as though the matter under discussion was of particular importance to him. His manner grew more animated as the minutes passed, his hands moving gently to emphasize certain points. The buffet continued its routine life around them. Mrs. Pringle thumped cups onto saucers with grim efficiency. A railway porter came in for tea, exchanged a few words with the commercial traveller, and left again. The boy at the luggage mound finally consumed the pie and wiped his hands on his trousers. The drizzle outside thickened into a more determined rain, streaking the windows and dimming the daylight until the lamps inside the buffet took on a dull yellow glow. Then, quite suddenly, the rhythm of the room shifted. Father Crisp, who had been in mid-sentence, stopped speaking. His face drained of colour, becoming a startling grey-white, and his hand clutched at his chest as though trying to steady some inner convulsion. The girl beside him half rose from her seat, her expression frozen between alarm and disbelief. For a moment, no one moved. The commercial traveller lowered his newspaper, blinking. Mrs. Pringle paused mid-step, holding a teapot aloft like a sceptre. Then, with a slow and dreadful inevitability, Father Crisp slid from his chair and collapsed to the floor. His suitcase tipped over beside him, spilling its meagre contents: a pair of socks, a worn prayer book, a small tin of lozenges, and onto the Scuffed linoleum. The envelope he had guarded so carefully slipped, unnoticed from his pocket, and came to rest beneath the edge of the table. The buffet erupted into confused motion. Mrs. Pringle lumbered forward, shouting for help in a voice more accustomed to scolding late arrivals. The young woman knelt beside the priest, though it was immediately clear to everyone that there was nothing she or anyone could do. The commercial traveller set down his cup and hurried to the door, calling for a doctor. The two elderly ladies murmured prayers, their faces pale and anxious. The railway porter returned with a harassed-looking man in a tweed coat, who knelt briefly, checked for signs of life, and then shook his head with quiet finality. The priest was beyond aid. His last breath had already been drawn. There followed a period of hushed confusion, as if the buffet itself were trying to decide what had just occurred. The body was lifted gently onto a bench near the wall and, covered with a travelling rug, Mrs. Pringle fetched her best teapot, an act of solemnity rather than hospitality, and poured tea for the shaken witnesses. Outside, the rain hammered against the windows as though to emphasize the finality of the scene within. The girl sat very still, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. Whatever Father Crisp had been telling her moments before his collapse remained unspoken, trapped forever in the space between his last unfinished words and the silence that followed them. The envelope beneath the table went entirely unnoticed. A passing boot shifted it slightly so that one corner protruded into the aisle, but no one looked down. When Inspector Purbright arrived a short time later, summoned by a brief and rather incoherent telephone message, the buffet had returned to a strange semblance of order. The passengers had mostly dispersed, leaving behind only the girl, Mrs. Pringle, and a few railway staff. The inspector's calm presence seemed to absorb the last of the panic. He examined the body with quiet professionalism, asked a handful of measured questions, and offered a few words of reassurance that were neither too hopeful nor too bleak. Outside, the train whistle sounded, and another departure clattered away into the mist. The buffet, though it would never say so, seemed relieved to resume its usual business of tea and indifference. Yet under one of its tables lay a silent piece of evidence, waiting for the hand that would one day pick it up. And with it, the thread of a story only just begun. In the corner, unnoticed by all but the inspector, a half-empty teacup cooled beside a plate of untouched seed cake. A small, unremarkable tableau that, like Father Crisp's final unfinished sentence, hinted at questions the town of Flaxborough had not yet thought to ask. By dawn, the rain had thinned to a civil drizzle that varnished the cobbles and taught the chimneys to smoke politely. Flaxborough looked newly washed and faintly contrite. Yesterday's collapse in the railway buffet did not so much travel as multiply. By breakfast, the tale had acquired 3 plots and several endings, all confident. At the Rose and Crown, Mrs. Oxley arrayed theories beside the marmalade. She began with poison administered by a jealous relative, advanced through foreign agents, and settled, out of loyalty, on the tea. Her certainty, sharply served and frequently replenished, discouraged contradiction. By 11 she had amended nothing and convinced several. Across the square, Miss Teetle arranged improving novels and lowered the town's voice to a communal whisper. She preferred the version involving an imminent confession and a wronged party who would, when identified, behave with exemplary dignity. Her borrowers left with books and a duty to be discreet in public and exhaustive in private. The newspaper office produced a headline that managed to alarm no one. Clergyman dies suddenly at station. The editor placed it above a fate notice so that sorrow and sponge would balance. The mayor, spectacles perched like small, disapproving birds, composed a statement urging inquiries to proceed quietly, preferably outside trading hours. He considered summoning Inspector Purbright to insist on a swift conclusion, but decided instead to intend it emphatically, which felt both mayoral and restful. In the police office, Constable Love rehearsed a pleasing line of thought. The buffet's manager poured the tea. Therefore the tea, the manager, and the collapse formed a triangle of guilt. Purbright, absorbed by a pen nib that had developed a philosophical reluctance to write, allowed the theory to pass like a draft and closed the window on it by asking for the day's timetable. Purbright's morning consisted of errands that looked like tidying and were. He visited the lodging house to see that Father Crisp's few belongings were listed. He telephoned the coroner with a polite pressure on haste. He wrote to a Brighton parish for copies of past accounts. He mentioned neither the cream envelope in his drawer nor the erased name in the church register. The railway buffet, scrubbed and rearranged, resumed duty with the offended dignity of a drawing-room after a fainting fit. Mrs. Pringle polished the urn until it glared and placed a collection box near the till in memory of the deceased and vindication of the tea. Travellers bought refreshments with pious caution and sat. Mr. Snipe had tendered his resignation from the parish council, citing health reasons. It was accepted with the kind of unanimity that comes from mutual relief. His name would not appear in any official account of the recent disturbances. There would be no trial, no public disgrace. This, Purbright had decided, was justice of a sort. Not perfect, but sufficient for a place like Flaxborough, where peace often depended on the careful arrangement of appearances. The missing funds were quietly restored. Widow Greeley received a discreet letter informing her that the aid once promised to her late sister had finally been delivered, though no explanation was given for the delay. She wept when she read it, but whether from sorrow or satisfaction, no one could say. Constable Love remained unsettled. "It doesn't sit right, sir," he said one evening, watching Purbright sort through a fresh stack of reports. Mr. Snipe steals from the church, hides it for years, and then walks away with nothing worse than a resignation. "Seems to me he got off lightly." Purbright did not look up. "Perhaps. But consider what remains to him, love. A man who has spent his life arranging appearances will find it no small punishment to live knowing that one person sees through them entirely. Shame, like a draught, seeps in even when the windows are closed." Love grumbled, but said no more. He was a man who preferred his justice to be visible like a constable's uniform. Purbright understood this, but he also understood that quiet resolutions, though less satisfying, were sometimes more effective. As days passed, the town's attention drifted to new concerns: the upcoming winter fete, a minor dispute over allotments, the mysterious disappearance of a shipment of apples. Life resumed its familiar pattern, and Father Crisp's visit began to fade into the background noise of memory. Miss Larkin, who had been so deeply affected by the priest's death, continued to think of him often. She took comfort in knowing that his journey had not been entirely in vain. When she encountered Purbright in the marketplace one morning, she thanked him simply for his kindness throughout the ordeal. He replied with a small, courteous bow and a remark about the weather, leaving her with the sense that he, too, carried a private grief beneath his calm exterior. On a particularly cold afternoon, Purbright returned to the church alone. The vestry had been repaired, the lock replaced, and the ledgers returned to their shelves. He stood for a long time looking at the space where the missing page had once been. The absence was now filled, the gap closed, yet the ragged memory of it remained, like a scar beneath new skin. He thought of Father Crisp's letter, now sealed away in his desk. It would never be made public. Its words were too heavy, too precise, to be allowed into the hands of a town that preferred its truths diluted with sugar. Some confessions, Purbright believed, were best preserved in silence. Leaving the church, he walked through the marketplace at dusk. Stalls were closing, lamps being lit, and the smell of roasting chestnuts drifted on the air. The scene was as ordinary as any winter evening, yet Purbright felt the subtle tension beneath it. The way people's voices lowered when they thought, themselves unobserved, the way certain glances were avoided. The balance had been restored, but balance is not the same as harmony. That night he sat alone in his office, the lamp casting a circle of light on the paperwork before him. Outside, the town settled into sleep, its secrets tucked away like fragile heirlooms. Purbright opened his drawer and took out the cream envelope one last time. He read the letter slowly, as if to fix its contents in memory, then folded it carefully and returned it to its place. There it would remain, unseen but not forgotten, a silent counterweight to the lies and half-truths that sustained Flaxborough's fragile peace. As he extinguished the lamp, the church bells tolled the hour. Their sound was steady, unremarkable, carrying across the rooftops like a promise. The inspector stood at the window for a moment, watching the faint glow of the street lamps in the mist. Life in Flaxborough would continue, small ambitions, small kindnesses, small cruelties, as it always had. The story of Father Crisp would fade, but its echo would remain, woven into the fabric of the town like a thread of darker colour, barely visible to the casual eye. Purbright turned away, ready to begin the next day's work. There would always be another disturbance, another quiet wrong to set right. That was the nature of places like Flaxborough, and of men like him. The clock ticked steadily in the silence. Outside, the frost returned, smoothing over the footprints of the day, as though nothing had happened at all. The girl who had sat with Father Crisp spent the morning at her aunt's, industrious in the manner of shock. She folded and refolded handkerchiefs, adjusted a vase by inches, and discovered that the house held too many clocks and none that would go backwards. What the priest had been about to say acquired weight precisely because it remained unsaid. Widow Greeley trimmed the dead heads from her roses and allowed memory its half-hour. She recalled a winter near the sea and a letter she had folded and never posted. The secateurs, patient and regular, returned a verdict long pending. What is left undone grows louder than what is done badly. At the undertaker's, Mr. Snipe tried on his professional calm like a black glove and found it, as always, an excellent fit. He inspected a satin lining, straightened a brochure, and contemplated the civic usefulness of silence. His nephew swept the step with attention to corners. The grocer's queue convened a committee and issued a report. The deceased had come to reconcile a family, or denounce a thief, or select a successor, or, less sensationally, complain about hymn tunes. Each interpretation suited the interpreter. None included the possibility that a small correction to an old account might be worth a long journey. Purbright, walking through these currents of certainty, bought bootlaces he did not need and received 2 summaries of the case while the change was counted. He observed how faces brightened at favourite passages of their own stories and dimmed politely near the inspector, as candles do when a door opens. Back at his desk, he unfolded notes into a modest map. A line linked a date to a name once penciled and then persuaded to disappear. Another joined the lodging house to the vestry by way of a bicycle. The lines pleased no one but the man drawing them, which made them promising. By afternoon the drizzle returned, thin and persevering. The market square collected reflections that looked like second thoughts. In several parlours the tale improved itself. Forged passports appeared, illicit romances bloomed, and a secret society of bell-ringers swore muffled vengeance. The coroner telephoned with a preliminary view that resembled nature behaving untidily. This, if necessary, would bear phrases about strain and travel. Purbright thanked him and wrote 2 words, not helpful. He did not expect disasters to be neat, but he expected panic to be clumsy. Toward evening he walked into the church, where the air kept a temperate account of incense already spent. The vestry was locked. The ledger within remained imperfect. A missing page is a kind of presence, he reflected, and a useful one. People approach an absence with their guard down. Outside, lamps flowered. The town resumed its preferred posture, forward to the world, ear turned back to the keyhole. At the buffet, a solitary cup cooled beside an untouched slice of seed cake, an unremarkable still life that had accidentally achieved the dignity of evidence. The platform clock ticked toward the next departure, offering timetables to those who doubted chronology. By nightfall, Flaxborough felt peacefully explained to itself. The inspector, who did not share that comfort, locked his drawer on the envelope and the ghost of a name and made a note to invite certain people to tea the next day. Polite company, he had learned, often unsettled impolite truth. The town slept with one ear open, waiting to hear the verdict it had already chosen. The following morning was pale and brittle, as though the weather had been scoured overnight and returned reluctantly to service. Frost clung to the cobbles, lending the streets of Flaxborough a deceptive brightness that looked festive from a distance and treacherous close at hand. It was a morning for brisk walks and guarded conversations. By the time Inspector Purbright left his house, several versions of yesterday's drama were already circulating like currency. Each bore the familiar wear of retelling, some rubbed almost smooth, others sharpened into unlikely points. The railway buffet, scrubbed and rearranged by Mrs. Pringle in a fit of defensive energy, had resumed its work with the wounded dignity of a drawing-room after a scandal. The urn hissed as though protesting innocence. The counter gleamed damply, and a new notice near the till advised customers that tea was brewed from only the finest ingredients. This declaration, written in Mrs. Pringle's emphatic hand, had the unfortunate effect of drawing more attention to the recent suspicion. Purbright's first task was to walk the short distance, from the police station to the buffet, and view the scene not as a place of refreshment, but as a stage on which yesterday's abrupt collapse had played its brief performance. The staff, having been rehearsed by Mrs. Pringle, offered their recollections with well-practiced uniformity. Father Crisp had entered quietly, taken a seat by the window, ordered tea and seed cake, and been joined later by a young woman. Nothing untoward was observed. Then, quite suddenly, there had been commotion, followed by the familiar flurry of summoning help and rearranging furniture to accommodate a body rather than a customer. Purbright made no attempt to disturb their carefully aligned memories. Instead, he studied the layout of the room, the position of the tables, the pattern of movement suggested by scuff marks on the worn linoleum. He noted, without comment, the faint line of tea stains on the counter that indicated hurried service at an earlier point in the day. The cup used by Father Crisp had already been washed, dried, and returned to service, a point Mrs. Pringle emphasized with a sniff of defiance. On the floor beneath the table where Father Crisp had sat, Purbright's eye caught a pale shape half hidden by the wooden leg. He bent, retrieved it, and found himself holding a small envelope, thick and faintly creased as though it had been handled often. There was no name on its surface, no address, only the impression of long travel in its softened edges. He slipped it into his coat pocket without remark, his expression as bland as the tea Mrs. Pringle insisted upon serving. From the buffet, Purbright proceeded to the lodging-house where Father Crisp had spent his brief stay in Flaxborough. The house was narrow and eternally on the verge of smelling of boiled cabbage. Its landlady, Mrs. Bletchley, met him at the door with an expression carefully balanced between grief and grievance. She declared that the priest had been a model lodger, causing no trouble and leaving his room as tidy as a hymn book. He had been out most of the day, returning only briefly to change his collar and collect what she assumed were church papers. No visitors had been seen entering or leaving. She repeated this last point several times, as if sheer frequency might make it truer. Purbright asked to view the room. Upstairs, in a narrow chamber that contained little more than a bed, a washstand, and a small writing table, he examined the few possessions Father Crisp had brought: a worn prayer book, a spare shirt, a travel brush, and a pair of spectacles folded neatly in their case. Everything suggested transience, as though the priest had travelled light not merely from necessity, but from intention. On the writing table lay a church register, its cover slightly askew. Purbright opened it casually, turning the pages until he reached one where a name had been entered in pencil and then heavily erased. Only a faint shadow of letters remained, resisting total oblivion. He closed the register without comment and asked Mrs. Bletchley, in a tone so mild it might have been about the weather, whether Father Crisp had taken tea in his room. She frowned, thought, and said that he had done so once, perhaps twice. The cups had been returned clean each time. Back on the street, Purbright paused to review what he had seen. The erased name and the unaddressed envelope did not yet connect, but both suggested a narrative longer than the brief span of Father Crisp's visit. The inspector was accustomed to stories that began before their actors realized they were on stage. The next calls were on those who had been present at the buffet when the incident occurred. The commercial traveller, interviewed at the railway hotel, proved vague and apologetic. He remembered little beyond his own discomfort at witnessing a sudden death in so public a setting. The two elderly ladies encountered later at the grocer's supplied detail in abundance, but none that survived scrutiny. Their memories were embroidered with conjecture until fact and fancy were indistinguishable. Each account, Purbright reflected, was less about Father Crisp than about the teller. In their eagerness to contribute, the witnesses revealed only themselves. Mrs. Pringle's pride, the lady's appetite for drama, the traveller's wish to be uninvolved. By afternoon, Purbright had a collection of statements that resembled a set of mismatched teacups, individually serviceable, collectively incoherent. He returned to the police station to sort them, though the sorting produced no pattern, only a deeper appreciation for Flaxborough's talent for confusion. Constable Love, meanwhile, busied himself with a theory so straightforward it required little evidence. To him, the case was simple. Mrs. Pringle had poured the tea, Father Crisp had drunk it, and soon after, Father Crisp was dead. In Love's view, there were only two possible explanations, both involving Mrs. Pringle and a substance unfriendly to digestion. Purbright allowed Love to outline this theory in full, nodding at appropriate intervals. When the constable concluded with a flourish, Purbright merely said that straightforward theories were like railway timetables, admirable in design, less reliable in practice. Love took this as agreement and returned to his paperwork, satisfied. As evening fell, Purbright sat alone in his office, the day's notes spread before him like pieces of a puzzle without a picture. The envelope lay beside them, unopened. Its weight was negligible, but its presence shifted the balance of the case in ways he could not yet define. Beyond the window, the lamps of Flaxborough glimmered through the mist. Somewhere among those lighted windows lived the person Father Crisp had travelled so far to meet, the one whose name had been pencilled in and then erased. Somewhere among them, too, was the hand that had guided events toward yesterday's abrupt conclusion, whether by intent or by the simple clumsiness of fear. Purbright rose, gathered the papers, and locked them in a drawer. Tomorrow would bring fresh questions and perhaps an answer or two. For now the town could rest in its usual uneasy peace, believing that a sudden death was either natural or tidy. The inspector knew better. Death, like truth, rarely arrived on schedule. It simply appeared, claimed its place at the table, and waited for someone to notice. By the next morning, Flaxborough had fully adjusted itself to the notion of being at the centre of a mystery. The railway buffet, having regained its composure, was once again a hub of rumours and refreshments. The trains came and went with their usual indifference, while the townsfolk lingered on the platform with greater than usual interest, hoping to catch some whiff of scandal in the steam. News of Father Crisp's collapse had now filtered into every household, shop, and public house, growing more elaborate at each retelling. The Flaxborough Gazette published a cautious second article that provided no facts, but an abundance of space for speculation. It carefully avoided the word poison, but readers obligingly supplied it between the lines. By the time the paper reached breakfast tables, the story had already branched into 3 competing theories: an act of divine judgment, a family vendetta, or a very poor standard of catering. Of these, the last was the most appealing to those who had recently partaken of the buffet's seed cake. Mrs. Pringle, naturally, was the focus of this third theory. She had been running the buffet for 3 decades with the unyielding authority of a monarch and did not take kindly to insinuations about her tea. Her reaction, loud and indignant, only served to fuel the gossip. She scrubbed the counter with unnecessary force, rearranged the urns and cups in precise formations, and addressed every customer as though daring them to find fault. The notice she had hung declaring only the finest ingredients used here now seemed less a reassurance than a challenge. While the town seethed, Inspector Purbright maintained his usual quiet routine. He began the day by reviewing his notes at the station, then walked slowly to the buffet, his hands clasped behind his back. His manner gave no hint of urgency, yet his eyes missed nothing. The tables, the positions of chairs, even the way the floorboards creaked beneath certain steps, all were observed and quietly stored away. Constable Love was waiting outside, his expression eager and self-satisfied. He had been working on a theory which, to his mind, fit the facts perfectly. It was a theory so direct and satisfying that he could scarcely keep from announcing it to anyone within earshot. Inside the buffet, Purbright and Love stood side by side, surveying the scene. Mrs. Pringle, her face flushed from the combined effects of indignation and steam, glared at them over the rim of the largest teapot. Purbright asked a few measured questions about the events of that afternoon. Mrs. Pringle answered with clipped precision, her words stripped of anything that might be misinterpreted. Father Crisp had ordered tea and seed cake. She had prepared them herself, delivered them personally, and then returned to her duties behind the counter. When the commotion began, she had been at least 10 feet away. She repeated these details with the weary emphasis of one obliged to prove her innocence through sheer volume. Love listened, nodding at each point, then offered his interpretation once they were outside. In his view, the situation was obvious. Mrs. Pringle had both motive and opportunity. She controlled the tea and the kitchen. No one else had access. The priest had drunk what she gave him, and shortly thereafter he died. For Love, there was a straight line from teapot to tragedy, with no detours required. Purbright, as was his habit, gave no direct contradiction. He merely remarked that straightforward lines often concealed interesting curves. Love, undeterred, pressed his case with growing enthusiasm, citing Mrs. Pringle's stern manner as evidence of a guilty conscience. Purbright pointed out mildly that sternness was her habitual expression and therefore of no evidentiary value. Love muttered something about too clever by half and fell silent, though his expression made clear that his mind was already rehearsing an arrest. Back at the police station, Love spent the next hour drafting an imaginary charge sheet, while Purbright attended to quieter tasks. He wrote a letter to the coroner requesting precise details of Father Crisp's condition prior to his death. He made a note to contact the Brighton parish for any correspondence that might shed light on the priest's visit, and he carefully placed the cream envelope, still unopened, into the top drawer of his desk. Its presence seemed to weigh more heavily with each passing hour, though he resisted the temptation to break its seal prematurely. As the day wore on, the mayor sent word requesting a private meeting. Purbright walked to the town hall, where he found the mayor seated behind an enormous desk, his features arranged in a pattern of civic concern. The conversation was brief but revealing. The mayor's principal interest lay not in justice, but in appearances. He urged Purbright to reach a swift conclusion, any conclusion, that would calm the townsfolk and protect Flaxborough's reputation. Preferably, this conclusion would involve natural causes and absolve all local parties of wrongdoing. Purbright listened politely, his face giving nothing away. When the mayor finished, the inspector merely remarked that truth, unlike rumour, could not be scheduled to appear on demand. The mayor, interpreting this as agreement, expressed his gratitude and dismissed him with relief. By late afternoon, word of the mayor's desire for a quick resolution had somehow leaked into the public sphere. At the grocer's, customers whispered that the whole thing will be sorted by tomorrow. At the library, Miss Teetle hinted that a prominent figure was about to be vindicated. At the Rose and Crown, Mrs. Oxley declared that if no one was arrested soon, she would personally conduct an inquest over the next round of drinks. Purbright walked through this haze of expectation with his usual unhurried step. His observations were as meticulous as ever, but they were shared with no one. The erased name in the church register remained uppermost in his thoughts, though he did not yet know how it related to Father Crisp's final journey. As dusk approached, he returned to the lodging-house. Mrs. Bletchley met him at the door, fluttering with curiosity and restrained indignation. She repeated her earlier statements about Father Crisp's behaviour, adding a few minor details she had recalled in the meantime, a question he had asked about local church matters, the way he had examined a particular ledger with unusual care. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a young man on a bicycle had visited briefly the day before, inquiring about collection boxes. She could not remember his name, but she did recall his haste. This last remark, so lightly offered, seemed to please Purbright. He thanked Mrs. Bletchley with grave courtesy and departed without explanation. Night settled over Flaxborough, muting the chatter but not extinguishing it. Behind curtained windows, families rehearsed their own theories, each secure in the knowledge that they alone understood the truth. In the quiet of his office, Purbright spread his notes across the desk like pieces of a puzzle. In one corner lay the unopened envelope. In another, a sheet marked with the single, ghostly trace of an erased name. Constable Love returned just before closing time, full of certainty and impatience. He urged immediate action against Mrs. Pringle, convinced that delay would only embolden her. Purbright listened, nodded, and made no promises. When Love had gone, the inspector leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a moment of reflection. The town, the mayor, even his own constable were eager for a solution that was simple, swift, and wrong. But Purbright had seen enough to suspect that Father Crisp's death was merely the visible ripple of a deeper disturbance. The truth, he thought, was like the envelope in his drawer, unassuming on the surface, but containing matters that would not stay hidden forever. Outside, the night train rumbled past, indifferent to the secrets of the town it served. The morning that followed was one of those pale, thinly lit affairs that gave Flaxborough the air of having been recently laundered and hung out to dry. The frost of the previous night lingered in shaded corners, crisp and treacherous, while a faint mist drifted in from the river, softening the edges of roofs and lamp-posts. The market square bustled with modest activity, women carrying baskets of vegetables, tradesmen sweeping their thresholds, and early shoppers pausing to exchange snippets of the latest version of Father Crisp's demise. The gossip had settled into its familiar rhythm, brisk, confident, and largely inaccurate. In the police station, Inspector Purbright spent the first hour in quiet contemplation of the evidence so far. His notes lay neatly arranged on the desk, alongside the cream envelope still sealed and untouched. Its presence was both a temptation and a rebuke. He knew the town's appetite for explanation would soon demand to be fed, but he preferred to let facts simmer before lifting the lid. Rushing to conclusions was as unwise, he thought, as tasting a pudding half-cooked. Across the hall, Constable Love was already at work, though work in this instance consisted largely of pacing and muttering. His theory regarding Mrs. Pringle's guilt had grown in detail overnight. In Love's mind, the buffet manager had gone from a woman of sharp tongue and clean counters to a schemer with access to poisons and an ungovernable temper. He rehearsed the imagined scene of the crime repeatedly, adding flourishes of motive and opportunity, until the story almost convinced him of its own truth. Purbright, aware of Love's preoccupation but unwilling to encourage it, left without comment to conduct his own investigations. His first call of the day was to Father Crisp's lodging house. The narrow building, eternally on the verge of smelling of boiled cabbage, greeted him with its usual aura of grudging hospitality. Mrs. Bletchley met him at the door, bristling with equal parts grief and curiosity. She was eager to know what progress had been made, but careful to present her questions as mere expressions of civic duty. Father Crisp's room remained much as it had been, austere, tidy, and uninformative. Purbright examined the small writing table near the window, where a church register lay precisely where he had seen it before. This time, however, he noticed something new, or perhaps something so ordinary that it had previously escaped notice. Near the corner of the table was a faint ring-shaped mark, the kind left by a drinking glass. Its presence would have been unremarkable were it not for the fact that Mrs. Bletchley had earlier insisted Father Crisp never took refreshments in his room. Purbright crouched to examine the mark closely. It was recent, the wood still faintly damp to the touch. This suggested someone had been there after Mrs. Bletchley's last cleaning. He replaced the register without a word and began to search the drawers with the methodical care of a man checking cupboards for moths rather than clues. In the bottom drawer, tucked behind a frayed scarf, he found a small scrap of paper. On it, written in a neat, deliberate hand, were 4 items: soap, 2 candles, stamps, polish. Beneath the list was a single initial. It was the kind of trivial object easily overlooked or dismissed, yet Purbright regarded it with interest. Lists are unassuming things, but they have the virtue of being honest. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket before descending the stairs. Mrs. Bletchley, seeing him emerge, launched into a description of her morning tasks, but Purbright merely thanked her and took his leave. Back on the street, the mist was lifting, revealing the crooked outlines of the town in sharper relief. Purbright walked with his usual unhurried stride, allowing his thoughts to move at the same pace. The initial R nagged at him, as did the erased name in the register. Separate facts for now, but perhaps, in time, 2 points on the same line. As he approached the marketplace, he encountered Miss Larkin, the young woman who had been present at the buffet when Father Crisp died. She looked pale and drawn, as though sleep had eluded her. Her hands clutched a parcel too tightly. The paper creased beneath her fingers. She explained with visible effort that she had remembered something from that afternoon. A detail that seemed insignificant at the time, but now troubled her. Just before his collapse, Father Crisp had been speaking with unusual urgency. He had said, almost to himself, "The ledger must be balanced even if the cost is dear." Miss Larkin admitted she had assumed he was speaking of church finances or some private spiritual matter, but the phrase, when recalled later, carried a note of foreboding she could not shake. Purbright listened with his customary patience, neither encouraging nor dismissing her recollection. Words, he knew, often outlived their speakers in ways more revealing than intended. He thanked her and made a mental note to consider this new fragment alongside his growing collection of mismatched pieces. From the marketplace, Purbright walked to the church. The heavy wooden doors opened reluctantly, releasing a cool, slightly damp smell of stone and old hymnals. Inside, the building was empty save for a scattering of unlit candles and a single shaft of light falling across the pews. The vestry, where the parish records were kept, was locked. Purbright examined the door and found no sign of forced entry. He noted the absence rather than the presence of disturbance. Sometimes what is missing tells the most. On his way back to the station, he stopped briefly at the railway buffet. Mrs. Pringle was presiding over her domain with formidable energy, her every movement designed to convey innocence and competence. The urn gleamed, the cups sparkled, and the seed cake sat proudly under a glass dome like a relic on display. She greeted Purbright with a mixture of defiance and wounded pride, declaring that her establishment had never been the scene of anything more sinister than a late train. Purbright accepted a cup of tea he did not drink, observing the precise choreography of Mrs. Pringle's service. No detail escaped her control, the way each spoon was aligned, the exact angle of the plates. Such precision, he reflected, was admirable in tea-making but suspicious in life. When he returned to the station, Constable Love was waiting, flushed with the satisfaction of having refined his theory still further. He presented a neat chain of events. Mrs. Pringle had poisoned Father Crisp's tea, panicked when he collapsed, and now sought to conceal her guilt beneath a veneer of indignation. It was, Love declared, a case ready for resolution. Purbright listened politely before setting down his cup. In response, he produced the scrap of paper marked with the initial R and placed it on the desk. Love stared at it blankly. To Love it was meaningless. To Purbright, it was the beginning of a different story, one in which motives were quieter, connections subtler, and the truth concealed not in cups of tea, but in the overlooked corners of everyday life. As dusk fell, Purbright sat alone reviewing his notes. The envelope remained unopened, its secret intact. The erased name in the register hovered like a shadow on the edge of understanding. And now there was this scrap of paper, trivial on its own but possibly significant when combined with other fragments. Somewhere in Flaxborough, someone had grown careless. A glass left on a table, a name half erased, a list tucked hastily into a drawer. These were not dramatic clues, but Purbright valued them more than drama. They were the quiet mistakes of fear, and fear, he knew, was a better witness than truth. Night gathered slowly, settling over the town like a heavy curtain. Behind drawn blinds, the citizens of Flaxborough continued their speculations, blissfully unaware that their inspector had begun to weave a different pattern entirely, one that would, in time, draw them all together in ways they had not yet imagined. The following morning broke with a peculiar brightness, a brittle sunlight that made the rooftops glitter like thin glass and revealed every imperfection in the cobbled streets. The frost, reluctant to release its hold, lingered in shaded alleys where only stray cats dared tread. To an observer at a distance, Flaxborough looked picturesque and peaceful. Up close it was merely cold and nosy. By now, Father Crisp's death had been fully absorbed into the town's conversational bloodstream. Every shop, parlour and public house had developed its own preferred theory. Mrs. Oxley insisted on poison, Miss Teetle favoured a lost love affair, and Mr. Hopgood had moved on to a plot involving smuggling and secret codes. Even those who privately doubted these scenarios repeated them eagerly, for there was a peculiar satisfaction in sharing a tale while simultaneously disclaiming belief in it. Inspector Purbright observed this swirl of speculation with his usual equanimity. Rumours, like rivers, revealed more about the landscape through which they flowed than about their supposed source. He had spent the previous day collecting fragments, a half-erased name in a church register, an unopened envelope, a scrap of paper marked with a solitary R, and Miss Larkin's recollection of Father Crisp's final cryptic words about balancing a ledger. None of these, taken alone, amounted to anything more substantial than mist. Together they suggested the outline of a shape that was only just beginning to emerge. Constable Love, meanwhile, remained steadfastly focused on Mrs. Pringle. In his mind, the case was already solved, requiring only the formalities of accusation and confession. Love's conviction was so complete that he had begun to speak of the matter as if the trial had already concluded and the buffet had been awarded damages for wrongful suspicion. Purbright neither encouraged nor discouraged him. Certainty, he believed, was a useful tool so long as one did not mistake it for truth. It was clear to Purbright, however, that the scope of his inquiry must now widen. Father Crisp's visit, brief though it had been, touched more corners of the town than a single buffet table or lodging house. The inspector decided to trace those corners systematically, beginning with the church and radiating outward like ripples from a stone dropped in a pond. The parish church stood at the centre of Flaxborough like a patient observer. Its tower was modest, its windows clouded by centuries of candle smoke. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of beeswax and stone dust. Reverend Hopley greeted Purbright with the flustered warmth of a man unused to visitors who asked questions instead of confessions. The vestry had already been carefully checked. The registers were intact, save for the one name that had been penciled in and then erased. The missing page from the donations ledger had not yet been discovered, though its absence was obvious by the abrupt break in the sequence of dates. Reverend Hopley expressed bewilderment at the idea that anyone might steal from the church. His bewilderment deepened when Purbright gently pointed out that theft of information was often more valuable than theft of coins. Timothy Dawes, the young church helper, appeared during this conversation, carrying a tray of candles. He was an eager, anxious youth whose hands trembled slightly even when unburdened. Purbright noted his agitation but asked no questions for the moment. People often revealed more by what they concealed than by what they offered. Leaving the church, Purbright turned his attention to those indirectly connected to Father Crisp. He began with Mr. Broom, the hotel clerk who had checked the priest in upon his arrival. Broom was a small, precise man whose moustache seemed permanently startled. He remembered Father Crisp clearly, a quiet, courteous guest who asked many questions about old names and addresses. Broom admitted, with some embarrassment, that he had been unable to answer most of these inquiries. The names meant nothing to him, though he suspected they referred to families who had once been prominent in the town. Intriguingly, Broom also mentioned that shortly after Father Crisp left the hotel that first evening, the local undertaker, Mr. Snipe, had appeared to ask whether anyone had been inquiring about him. Broom had thought little of it at the time, assuming professional curiosity. Now he realized the coincidence might not be entirely innocent. Purbright's next stop was Mr. Snipe's premises. The undertaker's shop was dimly lit with a smell of polish and lilies. Mr. Snipe himself was tall, thin, and impeccably grave. His voice, when he spoke, was so soft it seemed designed not to disturb the living. He claimed to have no knowledge of Father Crisp beyond what he had read in the paper. The question about hotel inquiries, he said, was merely routine business, a check to see whether a family expected his services soon. Purbright listened, nodded, and asked nothing further. The absence of questions sometimes provoked more revealing silences than interrogation ever could. He did, however, observe that Snipe's nephew Richard, who swept the step outside, avoided meeting his gaze. The young man's shoulders hunched defensively, as though to shield himself from words not yet spoken. By afternoon, Purbright's list of names and places had grown considerably. He visited Widow Greeley, whose late husband had once been a churchwarden. She received him in a parlour that smelled of lavender and stern judgment. Widow Greeley confirmed that she had known Father Crisp in his Brighton days, though she insisted their acquaintance was distant and wholly respectable. She spoke with particular bitterness about certain decisions made by the parish council many years ago, decisions that, in her view, had resulted in unfair treatment of deserving families. Her recollections were sharp, though not always reliable. From Widow Greeley's house, Purbright moved on to a retired schoolmaster who hinted darkly at irregularities in church funds, during a period he declined to specify. A former bell ringer mentioned seeing a stranger arguing with a clergyman near the churchyard late one night, though he could not be sure of the identities involved. A shopkeeper reported that Father Crisp had purchased a new pen and a single sheet of writing paper, paying in exact change and asking no questions. Each fragment added to Purbright's understanding, though not always in ways immediately visible. He recorded them carefully, as a gardener plants seeds whose growth may not be evident for weeks. Meanwhile, Constable Love grew restless. His desire for a swift resolution was now tempered by frustration at Purbright's deliberate pace. Love followed his superior on several calls, only to find himself bewildered by the inspector's apparent lack of action. Where Love saw opportunities for direct questioning and quick arrests, Purbright saw only the need for further listening. To occupy himself, Love began interviewing townsfolk on his own initiative. These unsanctioned conversations produced more heat than light. By early evening, he had returned to the station with a notebook full of contradictory statements and the firm belief that everyone in town was lying about something, though not necessarily about Father Crisp. As darkness fell, Purbright reviewed the day's findings. Certain patterns began to emerge. The erased name in the register and the missing ledger page were clearly connected. The initial R on the scrap of paper, though still ambiguous, now seemed less random, and Mr. Snipe's unexpected visit to the hotel clerk suggested a nervousness inconsistent with his outward calm. The inspector's thoughts returned to Miss Larkin's recollection. The ledger must be balanced, even if the cost is dear. The phrase now seemed less metaphorical, more literal. Balancing accounts implied debts owed and payments made, but whether these were financial or moral remained uncertain. Flaxborough, with its neat streets and tidy facades, presented itself as a place of simple respectability. Yet beneath that surface, Purbright sensed a web of obligations and resentments stretching back years. Father Crisp, by coming to town, had touched one strand of that web, and the vibration had set the whole structure trembling. The challenge now was not merely to discover who had cut a page from a book, but to understand why that page mattered so much. It was a question that reached beyond the death of a single man and into the heart of the community itself. Purbright extinguished his lamp and stood by the window. Outside, the frost was forming again, tracing delicate patterns on the glass. Somewhere beyond those patterns, in a house not far from the church, someone was watching too, guarding a secret with the same care a priest might guard a confession. The inspector's mouth curved in the faintest of smiles. The field had expanded, yes, but the circle of truth was beginning to contract. Soon, very soon, it would be small enough to hold in one hand. Flaxborough's mornings had a habit of looking innocent. That particular day began with pale sunlight scattered across the rooftops, warming nothing but revealing everything. The mist that clung to the riverbank drifted reluctantly through the streets, dissolving into thin ribbons as the town came to life. Stalls appeared in the marketplace, chimneys began to smoke, and doors opened just enough to let out both household heat and the first whispered rumours of the day. By now, Father Crisp's death was no longer a fresh event, but an established narrative, repeated so often it had acquired the dignity of fact. People spoke of it with the confidence of eyewitnesses, even if they had only read the headline or heard an embellished version from a neighbour. Mrs. Pringle's innocence or guilt, depending on one's preference, had been declared countless times before breakfast. Those who preferred melodrama favoured a deliberate poisoning. Those of a more practical bent leaned towards a sudden failure of the heart. It was, by this stage, a matter of personal taste. Inspector Purbright walked through these morning rituals with the same mild expression he might have worn when examining a shop window. The streets greeted him with nods, cautious half-smiles, and hastily withdrawn whispers. He gave nothing away. Behind his calm gaze, however, the puzzle was shifting. the erased name in the church register, the missing ledger page, the scrap of paper marked with the single initial R. These were fragments that might yet form a picture. The picture began to sharpen when Timothy Dawes burst into the station just after noon. He was a young man given to nervous energy, but on this occasion his agitation had reached an almost theatrical pitch. His coat was half-buttoned, his hair damp with sweat despite the cold. He gasped out a story of discovery. The vestry door at the parish church had been forced, the lock splintered crudely. At first, he had assumed clumsiness on the part of the bell ringers, but once inside, he saw the truth. One of the parish ledgers had been rifled through and a single page was missing. The gap was obvious, a neat absence between two neatly ruled sheets. In its place, a scattering of paper fibres lay like the remnants of a hasty meal. Purbright listened without interruption. When Timothy had exhausted both breath and vocabulary, the inspector rose, collected his hat, and followed him to the church. The vestry smelled of cold stone and candle wax. The air had that peculiar stillness found in places where silence is expected and therefore never entirely silent. The broken lock confirmed Timothy's account. Purbright crouched to examine it, noting the roughness of the break. It had been done quickly, with little skill. This was not the work of a professional thief, but of someone who had been driven by urgency rather than experience. The ledger itself lay open on the table, its missing page as eloquent as a shout. Purbright turned the remaining pages carefully. Names, dates, amounts. The ordinary record of donations made and received. To most eyes, it would be mundane bookkeeping. To someone, however, it had been dangerous enough to steal. Timothy hovered near the doorway, wringing his hands and glancing over his shoulder as though expecting the culprit to return at any moment. His voice, when he spoke, trembled. He admitted that very few people had access to this room, Reverend Hopley himself and a handful of trusted parishioners. None of them, he insisted, would do such a thing. Purbright offered no opinion, only asked for a list of keys and who held them. When he had finished examining the room, Purbright stepped outside. The winter sun was already sliding towards the horizon, turning the frost into treacherous patches of water. Constable Love was waiting by the gate, his breath puffing visibly in the cold. Love greeted the news with an eagerness bordering on satisfaction. A break-in meant excitement, and excitement was preferable to patient observation. He immediately declared the theft connected to Father Crisp's death. In his mind, the link was obvious. First, a man silenced, now a record erased. Someone was cleaning up after themselves. Purbright did not contradict him outright. He merely observed that coincidences, while rare, were seldom impossible. Then, with his usual mildness, he pointed out that haste often betrayed more than it concealed. Whoever had taken the page was now exposed in ways they might not yet realize. The discovery spread through Flaxborough with predictable speed. By the time evening fell, the break-in had eclipsed Father Crisp's death as the town's favourite topic. Theories multiplied like frost patterns on a window. Mrs. Oxley was certain it involved foreign agents. Miss Teetle, ever literary, preferred to think of it as the climax of a long-running feud between rival church factions. Mr. Hopgood, with the confidence of ignorance, combined both theories into a tale of spies disguised as bell-ringers. At the railway buffet, Mrs. Pringle adopted an air of superior dignity. The intrusion at the vestry, she announced, proved her own innocence by redirecting suspicion elsewhere. Her customers, who had once looked at her teapots with wariness, now regarded them with renewed trust, though still without enthusiasm. For Purbright, the incident was less about distraction than confirmation. The theft told him that someone was truly frightened. A death might be natural, even accidental, but tearing a page from a ledger was a deliberate act. It spoke of motive, of calculation, and of fear, urgent enough to risk exposure. That night, in his office, Purbright spread out his notes. The envelope remained unopened beside them, a silent companion to his thoughts. He considered the timing, Father Crisp's collapse followed by the theft within days. If the priest's purpose in coming to Flaxborough had been to reveal a truth, then the stolen page might well be the very thing he intended to expose. The question was not merely who had taken it, but what they had hoped to hide. The next morning brought another shift. Constable Love, dispatched to speak with townsfolk, returned with a list of passengers present in the buffet on the day of Father Crisp's death. Among them was a name that caused Purbright's eyes to narrow slightly: Richard Snipe, nephew of the undertaker. Richard's presence was easily explained. He often collected parcels from the station. But coincidences, Purbright reflected, were piling up with suspicious neatness. The elder Mr. Snipe's inquiry at the hotel desk about strangers asking questions now seemed less like professional curiosity and more like defensive reconnaissance. Purbright filed this thought away without sharing it with Love, who was already constructing elaborate scenarios involving secret meetings behind the churchyard wall. Late in the day, Purbright visited Reverend Hopley to confirm a few details. The vicar's study was cluttered with hymnals, unpaid bills, and potted plants clinging bravely to life. Hopley himself was pale and worried, his hands fluttering among the papers like startled birds. He confessed that he could not understand why anyone would want to remove a ledger page. The sums involved were small, almost trivial. But when Purbright asked about past treasurers, the vicar's answers grew hesitant. Years ago, he admitted, there had been some confusion over accounts. A former treasurer had died suddenly, leaving matters unresolved. Father Crisp at the time had corresponded about the issue but had not been directly involved. Purbright made a note of the treasurer's name, Rowntree. The initial R began to feel less random. As night fell, Flaxborough seemed quieter than usual, as though the town were holding its breath. Behind drawn curtains, conversations grew hushed and speculative. Purbright, walking back to the station, paused to look at the lamplit windows. Somewhere within those tidy houses was a person who had risked much to tear out a page, believing that by destroying paper they could destroy memory. But memory, he knew, was more resilient than ink. Fear had forced the culprit's hand once. It would do so again. The inspector's pace quickened slightly. The circle of mystery was closing, and with each narrowing step, someone's secret life was being compressed into a very small and dangerous space. Night came to Flaxborough, like a slow, reluctant tide rolling over the town in muted layers of grey and blue. The lamps were lit one by one, small yellow eyes blinking open in narrow streets, while the river absorbed the last of the daylight and held it deep beneath its surface. It was a night for drawn curtains, cautious conversation, and doors locked perhaps a shade earlier than usual. Inside the police station, Inspector Purbright sat alone in his office, the single lamp on his desk throwing a pool of light over an untidy geography of papers, notes, and unanswered questions. The air smelled faintly of damp wool and cooled tea. Outside his window, a thin frost was forming on the cobbles, tracing delicate, temporary maps that would vanish with the first footstep of morning. He sat very still, reviewing the case in the quiet theatre of his own mind. The narrative so far was unsatisfactory. A priest travelling from Brighton, a sudden death in a railway buffet, a page torn from a church ledger, and a trail of nervous glances and half-formed lies scattered across the town like breadcrumbs dropped in haste. It was a story whose pieces did not yet fit together, though he could feel their edges pressing against one another. The unopened envelope lay near his elbow. For hours it had been there, untouched, its presence both urgent and reproachful. It was a silent witness, containing answers he might yet need, but was not ready to claim. He preferred to assemble the picture himself before consulting the printed solution. Purbright thought again of Father Crisp's final moments, as described by Miss Larkin. The priest had spoken of balance. "The ledger must be balanced even if the cost is dear." It was not merely the language of church bookkeeping. There was weight in those words, the weight of an old promise or an old sin. The inspector considered the fragments he had gathered, the erased name in the parish register, the missing page from the donations ledger, the scrap of paper bearing the initial R, and the undertaker's unexpected curiosity about a stranger at the hotel. They were small things, individually trivial, but together they formed a subtle current. In that current, two names had surfaced again and again, Father Crisp and Rowntree, the former treasurer mentioned by Reverend Hopley. Rowntree was long dead, his accounts never properly resolved. If Father Crisp had travelled all this way to Flaxborough, it might not have been for a new matter at all, but to settle an old one, to tie off a loose thread left dangling years before. Purbright's gaze shifted to the cream envelope. If his theory was correct, its contents would confirm it. Yet he hesitated still. Once opened, the letter would speak clearly, and clarity has its dangers. A truth spoken aloud can never be unsaid. Sometimes it was better to let a secret breathe a little longer before confining it to the pages of an official report. Elsewhere in the town, the ripples of the break-in at the vestry were still spreading. Timothy Dawes, his nerves perpetually taut, sat in his small room above the church hall, replaying the events in his mind. He was certain he had locked the vestry door the previous evening. That certainty had become a burden. Each time he reassured himself, doubt crept back in, whispering that perhaps he had been careless. He could not decide which prospect frightened him more, the idea of an intruder, or the possibility that the fault was his alone. In another part of town, Mr. Snipe, the undertaker, sat immobile in his parlour, as stiff and formal as the furniture surrounding him. His nephew Richard had retired early, leaving Snipe alone with his thoughts. He stared at the darkened window, seeing nothing of the street beyond. The break-in had unsettled him. Though he had said little to anyone, his questions to the hotel clerk had been prompted by more than mere curiosity. Father Crisp's presence in Flaxborough was a shadow falling backward over years Snipe preferred not to revisit, and now a page was missing from the church ledger. To most that gap would appear meaningless. To Snipe, it was like a voice calling out of the past, reminding him that not all debts are paid in money. Back in his office, Purbright allowed his thoughts to drift over the day's encounters. Widow Greeley's tightly wound virtue, Mr. Broom's nervous precision, Reverend Hopley's fluttering anxiety. Each was a fragment of the puzzle, though none of them knew it. Even Constable Love, with his persistent fixation on Mrs. Pringle, was part of the picture in his own misguided way. Love's determination to see guilt where it was most visible provided cover for those whose guilt lay beneath the surface. The inspector reflected on the peculiar economy of small towns. Secrets here were never wholly private. They existed in a kind of shared custody. A person's reputation was like a bank account jointly held by their neighbours. Deposits and withdrawals were made in whispers, and a sudden overdraft could ruin not just the individual, but the entire community. Father Crisp, Purbright suspected, had come to reconcile a very old account. Whether he had hoped to make amends or to expose wrongdoing was not yet clear. What was clear was that someone else had wished desperately to prevent either outcome. Death had silenced the priest, but not the truth he carried. The theft of the ledger page was an act of fear. Fear, in Purbright's experience, was the most reliable clue of all. It forced people into mistakes, into hasty choices that revealed far more than calm deliberation ever would. Whoever had broken into the vestry had left not just a physical absence, but an emotional signature. The inspector rose and crossed to the window. Outside, the frost glittered faintly under the street lamps. Flaxborough lay quiet, almost peaceful, Yet Purbright knew that beneath that stillness the town's nerves were raw. Somewhere out there a man or woman sat in darkness, wondering whether the theft had been enough, whether the page they had destroyed would truly erase their past. He pictured that person rising suddenly, checking the lock on their door, peering through curtains at an empty street. Panic, Purbright thought, is rarely tidy. It leaves smudges and echoes. It cannot help itself. He returned to his desk and finally opened the envelope. The paper inside was closely written, the ink faded but legible. It was a confession of sorts, though more restrained than dramatic. Father Crisp had traced the history of a charitable fund, naming those who had administered it and those who had benefited, or failed to benefit, from its distribution. The sum involved was small, but the consequences had been bitter. One widow in particular, left without the aid she had been promised, had suffered greatly. At the bottom of the letter were 2 signatures, Crisp's own, and another, older, belonging to Rowntree. Purbright read the letter twice, folded it carefully and locked it away. The words were confirmation, not revelation. They matched the outline he had already begun to see. As midnight approached, Purbright left the station and walked slowly home through the deserted streets. The air was sharp with cold, his breath hanging briefly before dissolving into the darkness. He passed the church, its windows unlit, its tower rising like a sentinel against the stars. Somewhere inside lay the ledger, diminished by one missing page. Somewhere outside a person carried the weight of what that page had contained. Flaxborough slept, or pretended to. Behind its curtains, the town's collective imagination busied itself with theories and suspicions. But only one mind, Purbright reflected, would be truly restless tonight, the mind of the person who had stolen that page, wondering when the silence they had created would begin to speak. The inspector's footsteps faded into the stillness. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring a new test. The time for quiet reflection was ending. The time for action was about to begin. The dawn broke with a pale clarity that did little to warm Flaxborough's narrow streets. Thin sunlight crept reluctantly across the slate roofs, casting long shadows on the cobblestones and revealing with merciless precision every crack in the pavement and every smudge on the shopfront windows. It was a morning that made the town appear both picturesque and faintly guilty. By now, the uproar caused by the vestry break-in had reached its peak. The theft of the ledger page, following so closely on the heels of Father Crisp's sudden death, had given the townsfolk the narrative they craved. It was no longer just a tragedy. It was a drama with a cast of characters, motives, and whispered confessions. In shops and kitchens, theories multiplied faster than they could be disproved. Some insisted that the missing page contained evidence of a scandalous affair. Others preferred the notion of embezzlement, citing old grievances about church funds that had been spoken of for years in private but never dared aloud. At the railway buffet, Mrs. Pringle presided with renewed authority. Having been informally exonerated by the new development, she now spoke of the crime with the detachment of one who had suffered unfair suspicion and emerged victorious. Customers, who had been hesitant to meet her gaze only days earlier, now sought her opinions eagerly. Her tea, once eyed warily, was consumed with a mixture of relief and penitence. While the town indulged its appetite for speculation, Inspector Purbright remained outwardly serene. He spent the early hours at his desk, reviewing his notes with the calm of a man folding laundry. Each piece of information was smoothed, considered, and placed neatly alongside the others. Yet, beneath this apparent tranquility, a plan was forming. The case had reached a point where listening was no longer enough. It was time to act, but with subtlety. A direct accusation would only encourage denial and drive the truth further underground. What Purbright needed was a test, a way to unsettle the guilty without alarming the innocent. In a small town like Flaxborough, a public gathering was often more revealing than a private interrogation. People revealed themselves when they believed they were merely being social. Accordingly, Purbright suggested to Reverend Hopley that a modest fundraising tea be held in the parish hall, ostensibly to raise money for repairs to the church roof. The idea was greeted with enthusiasm. Mrs. Pringle agreed to provide refreshments, and Miss Teetle took on the task of spreading the word. By late morning, the event had become the talk of the town. Even those with no interest in church roofs were eager to attend, if only to see and be seen. The parish hall that evening was warm and crowded, filled with the mingled aromas of tea, cake, and expectation. Folding tables were arranged in neat rows, each bearing mismatched crockery and slightly overgenerous stacks of sandwiches. The townsfolk arrived in a steady stream, their voices rising and falling in the familiar rhythm of gossip disguised as concern. Purbright moved quietly among them, his manner as mild as ever. He greeted Widow Greeley with a respectful nod, inquired after Miss Teetle's latest book recommendations, and complimented Mr. Broom on the hotel's recent redecorating. To anyone watching, he appeared simply to be fulfilling his civic duty. Only Constable Love, stationed by the door, knew that every word and glance was being carefully observed and weighed. Mr. Snipe stood near the back, tall and motionless, his face as carefully composed as a funeral mask. Beside him, his nephew Richard shifted uneasily, his gaze darting about the room like a trapped bird. At precisely the moment when the atmosphere had grown comfortably noisy, Purbright tapped a teaspoon lightly against his cup. The sound was delicate, yet carried through the hall with surprising clarity. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. "Thank you all for coming," Purbright said pleasantly, as though addressing a meeting of a gardening club rather than a room full of potential suspects. "Your support for the church roof is greatly appreciated. While we are gathered here, I hope you won't mind indulging me in a brief curiosity of my own." The crowd leaned forward slightly, collectively intrigued. "You will have heard," Purbright continued, "that a page was recently removed from the parish ledger. This may seem a small matter, but I believe it has some importance. I wondered if anyone here might recall seeing that page, or perhaps even knowing what was written on it." His tone was light, almost conversational. The effect was anything but. A hush settled over the hall. Eyes shifted. Feet shuffled. Somewhere in the back, a spoon clinked nervously against porcelain. Purbright let the silence stretch just long enough, then added with deceptive casualness, "The last entry on that page, as it happens, was signed only with the letter R. It was a small remark, tossed like a pebble into still water. The ripples were immediate." Richard Snipe's head jerked up. His uncle's hand shot out, gripping his arm with a firmness that was meant to be reassuring, but looked more like restraint. The exchange was brief, but in its very brevity lay its significance. Purbright smiled gently and moved on to a discussion of sponge cakes and raffle tickets, as though nothing of consequence had occurred. The townsfolk, their curiosity sharpened, resumed their conversations with renewed vigour, unaware that the inspector had just marked the guilty party in his mental ledger. Later, when the hall had emptied and the last teapot was drained, Constable Love approached Purbright with barely contained excitement. "You saw it, sir." That look between Snipe and his nephew, you couldn't miss it. "Shall we bring them in now?" Purbright shook his head. "Not yet, love. Fear is like dough. It must be given time to rise. Tonight we simply needed it a little." Love looked disappointed. "But if they bolt, where would they go?" Purbright asked mildly. "Flaxborough is not a place that encourages flight." "No, they will stay. And in staying they will act." "The guilty always do." As they walked back through the quiet streets, Love continued to grumble. The inspector, however, was thoughtful. The evening had confirmed his suspicion that Father Crisp's visit and the missing ledger page were threads in the same fabric. The problem was no longer whether there had been wrongdoing, but how far back it reached, and how deeply it was stitched into the lives of those present. Behind the drawn curtains of the houses they passed, Purbright imagined scenes of restless wakefulness. Someone, somewhere, was pacing a narrow room, replaying the evening's events and wondering how much had been seen, how much guessed. That same someone would be deciding what to do next. And in that decision lay their undoing. Purbright's plan had worked. The trap was set not with force but with politeness, the kind of trap that relied on the guilty party's own imagination to spring it. All that remained was to wait for the next move. As they reached the station, Purbright glanced back once at the darkened parish hall. Its windows were now blank squares against the night sky, giving no hint of the small storm that had begun within. "Tomorrow, love," he said quietly, "we shall begin to see the pattern clearly." Constable Love frowned. "What pattern's that, sir?" "The pattern people make," Purbright replied, "when they believe they are no longer being watched." They entered the station, leaving the street silent behind them. Somewhere in Flaxborough, a guilty heart was beating too fast, and a plan born of desperation was taking shape. A plan that would bring the story and its secrets to light at last. The morning after the parish hall gathering was sharp and brittle, a day that glittered without warmth. Frost lay in thin silver sheets across the rooftops and pavements, while the air itself seemed to whisper that winter had not yet relinquished its hold. In the marketplace, shopkeepers swept their thresholds with a kind of ceremonial energy, each pretending that nothing of consequence had occurred the night before. But behind curtains and countertops, the talk of the town had turned to speculation of an altogether different nature. People had noticed things. Mrs. Oxley, who prided herself on noticing everything, reported that Richard Snipe had been quite flushed during the gathering, and that Mr. Snipe had kept his hand on the boy's arm with a grip too firm to be merely affectionate. Miss Teetle offered a more dramatic interpretation. She claimed to have seen in Mr. Snipe's eyes the terrible resignation of a man whose sin has been unearthed. By breakfast time, the entire parish had divided itself into factions, each convinced it knew exactly what had been revealed, though no one could quite agree on what that was. In the police station, Inspector Purbright read through his notes for the final time. The unopened cream envelope lay beside them, no longer a mystery but a key piece of evidence now fully understood. The previous evening's experiment had confirmed his suspicions. The glance between uncle and nephew, the tension that had gripped the hall when he mentioned the letter R, had been as clear as a signed confession. All that remained was to speak the truth aloud, calmly and precisely, before the gossipers filled in the gaps with their own inventions. Constable Love entered, red-cheeked from the cold and brimming with impatience. "They'll be expecting an answer today, sir," he said, tugging off his gloves. "The whole town's worked itself into a froth. I heard 3 separate theories just walking here from the post office. One of them involved smugglers disguised as bell ringers." Purbright closed his notebook with deliberate care. "And let us spare them further exertion. Summon Reverend Hopley, the Snipes, Widow Greeley, and a few others who have hovered on the edge of this matter. We shall meet in the vestry, an appropriate setting, I think." The vestry was cold but bright, sunlight slanting through the high windows and glinting on the polished wood of the pews. Chairs had been arranged in a neat semicircle, like pupils awaiting a lesson. Mrs. Pringle sat stiffly, arms crossed, her very posture declaring innocence. Mr. Broom shifted uneasily, while Widow Greeley gazed about her with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. Mr. Snipe entered with his usual funereal composure, his face a mask carved from stone. Richard followed close behind, pale and silent. Reverend Hopley fluttered nervously at the back, wringing his hands as though to remove invisible stains. Miss Larkin lingered by the doorway, anxious yet determined to see the matter resolved. When everyone was settled, Purbright remained standing. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet enough to compel attention. "We are gathered," he began, "to clarify certain events which have caused confusion and distress. Father Crisp's sudden death at the railway buffet was tragic, but let me state plainly, it was due to natural causes. There was no poison, no violence. His heart simply failed." Mrs. Pringle gave a sharp sniff of vindication, while Constable Love allowed himself a visible sigh of disappointment. "However," Purbright continued, "what followed his death was far less natural. A page was torn from the parish ledger, deliberately and in haste. That act was not motivated by grief or accident, but by fear. Fear that something written there might be seen." He paused, letting the silence settle like dust. All eyes were fixed on him now. "Years ago," he went on, "a charitable fund was established to aid a widow of this parish. 2 men were responsible for administering it, Father Crisp and Mr. Rowntree, the treasurer at the time. The money was collected, but it was never delivered. Instead, it was diverted," a murmur ran through the room. Widow Greeley's face tightened, her lips thinning to a sharp line. "Father Crisp," Purbright said, "was young and uncertain then. He allowed himself to be persuaded, by someone older, more confident, and more determined, that the money could be temporarily borrowed for other purposes. He regretted it deeply. In later years, that regret grew until it brought him back to Flaxborough, determined to set things right. He looked around the room, his gaze finally resting on Mr. Snipe. The second man involved was Mr. Snipe. When he learned Father Crisp had returned, he feared exposure. He could not silence the priest's conscience, but he could attempt to destroy the evidence. That is why the ledger page was torn out. It contained the final record of the transaction, written in Rowntree's hand and signed with a single initial, R. The room seemed to hold its breath. Richard made a small, involuntary movement, as though trying to disappear into his chair. His uncle's hand gripped his shoulder, steady but hard. Mr. Snipe's voice, when it came, was low and even. "You have no proof." Purbright's reply was gentle. "On the contrary, Father Crisp left a letter explaining everything. It was found among his effects. In it, he names you as the man who persuaded him to act against his better judgment." At this, Richard emitted a strangled gasp. His uncle shot him a warning glance, but the damage was done. The room's attention swung to the young man whose face had gone white. "Richard," Purbright said softly, "knew nothing of these events. His only mistake was to witness his uncle's agitation and fear. At the parish hall last night, when I mentioned the initial R, it was his reaction, and Mr. Snipe's response to it, that confirmed the truth." Widow Greeley rose abruptly, her voice trembling with fury. "My sister was that widow?" She waited for help that never came, while others pretended to act on her behalf. "You let her suffer," Mr. Snipe flinched as though struck. His composure cracked, revealing something raw beneath. "It was never meant to harm her," he said hoarsely. "There were other needs, pressing matters. I thought we could repay it before anyone noticed." "And when repayment proved impossible," Purbright finished quietly, "you relied on time and forgetfulness to bury the matter, until Father Crisp returned, bringing the past with him." The undertaker sagged into his chair, the fight gone out of him. Richard buried his face in his hands. Reverend Hopley, visibly shaken, asked what would happen now. "There will be no public trial," Purbright said. "The funds will be restored from Mr. Snipe's estate. The widow's name will be cleared quietly. Mr. Snipe will resign from all public duties. This matter will end as it began, privately." Mrs. Pringle sniffed again, less from indignation now than from satisfaction. "And what of my tea?" she demanded. "Entirely blameless," Purbright assured her gravely. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Larkin lingered. "Inspector," she said softly, "Father Crisp. He didn't die in vain, then?" "No," Purbright replied. "He came to balance a ledger, and in a way, he succeeded." She nodded. tears shining in her eyes, then slipped quietly away. Outside, the frost had begun to melt under the noonday sun. The town seemed, to casual eyes, unchanged. Children played in the square, shop bells jingled, and trains came and went as they always had. But for those who had been in the vestry that morning, the world was subtly altered. A hidden weight had been lifted, though not entirely removed. Flaxborough, like the ledger itself, was once again complete, yet bearing the faint scar of a page forever missing. Purbright stood alone for a moment, watching the townsfolk move about their day, each carrying secrets of their own. Truth, he reflected, was rarely dramatic. It was often quiet, almost invisible, like a single entry in a very long book. He turned and walked back to the station, his pace unhurried, his mind already moving on to the next small disturbance that might ripple across the surface of Flaxborough's calm. The day after the vestry gathering began with a stillness that seemed almost deliberate, as if the town itself had resolved to move quietly, to avoid drawing attention to what had transpired. The frost had retreated to shaded corners, leaving damp patches on the cobbles and a faint sheen of ice on the riverbank. Overhead the sky was pale and cloudless, a blank page against which nothing dramatic was permitted to be written. Flaxborough's routines resumed with surprising speed. The market square filled with the usual stalls, vegetables arranged in symmetrical piles, bolts of fabric draped with care, the fishmonger announcing his wares with a voice that carried 3 streets away. Children clattered past on their way to school, trailing laughter that seemed too bright for the season. From the outside it might have appeared as though nothing at all had happened. But beneath the surface calm, a subtle change had taken place. People still whispered, of course. Flaxborough without gossip would be like a clock without ticking, but their tones were more cautious now, their glances sharper. Theories about Father Crisp's death were retold with a new delicacy, like fragile china handled by uncertain hands. The version most favoured in public was the one Purbright himself had quietly suggested, that the priest had come to settle a small matter of parish accounts and had been overtaken by natural causes. It was a story both respectable and sufficiently dull to soothe the collective conscience. In private, however, there were hints of other tales. Mrs. Oxley maintained that she had seen a guilty expression on Mr. Snipe's face, though she could not say exactly what the guilt pertained to. Miss Teetle, borrowing her own books to herself, murmured of hidden sins beneath black cloth. Mr. Hopgood, with characteristic confidence, declared that there had been a conspiracy involving at least 3 outsiders, possibly more, and that the missing ledger page had been burned in a distant city to conceal evidence of smuggling. The truth, as Purbright knew, lay somewhere far quieter and far sadder than any of these imaginings. In the railway buffet, Mrs. Pringle had achieved a state of serene vindication. Her urns gleamed, her cups sparkled, and her seed cake sat beneath its glass dome like a prize exhibit. The collection box she had placed near the counter bore a small placard. In memory of Father Bartholomew Crisp, donations, welcome. Travellers purchased tea and sandwiches without hesitation now, their earlier suspicions dissolved into embarrassed gratitude. Mrs. Pringle accepted their coins with the magnanimity of one wronged but ultimately forgiving. She spoke freely of Father Crisp's final moments, always emphasizing how she had done everything by the book and how the inspector himself had declared her establishment above reproach. The buffet had become once more what it had always been, a place of departures and arrivals, of half-heard conversations and unnoticed endings. Only the inspector, when he passed through, gave the place more than a cursory glance, his eyes lingering for a moment on the table where the priest had sat. To anyone else it was just another piece of furniture. To Purbright, it was a silent witness. At the undertaker's premises, the change was more dramatic. The front shutters remained closed for most of the day. Within, Mr. Snipe moved quietly about his work, his once impeccable composure now shadowed by weariness. His nephew Richard had taken on more of the public duties, sweeping the steps, greeting customers with a politeness that bordered on apology. The townsfolk, in their tactful way, pretended not to notice.